Hello, everybody, and welcome. Hope everybody, as we just started this, we record these. I hope you're aware of that. Is that okay? Okay, cool. I'm seeing a thumbs up. Great, awesome. Welcome to the final course in our semester 2 of our Data Together reading group. Very much looking forward to today's topic is decentralization. But just a little signposting, we have planned our semester 3. We have not set dates for it, but we are now starting to field and collect readings for our next semester, which we'll figure out the dates for it at some point in the future. But the subject for semester 3, sort of like overarching theme, is going to be polity, and this notion that like, what does it mean to be participating in a government? And so that'll, or a governing structure, I guess, would be a better way of phrasing that. But yeah, cool. And so tonight, my name is V5. I'm going to be helping to facilitate a discussion that hopefully I will be stepping forward, giving a little preamble, and then stepping back. This topic of tonight's conversation is decentralization. And so tonight, this is a conversation about a word that has pulled a number of us together over the years, months, minutes. I think decentralization is very interesting. As far as words go, decentralization to me is an angsty teenager. It's like this super cool word that refuses to pick a lane. It hangs out with other really cool words like disrupt and design and open, and it doesn't. And clearly, it doesn't like fully identify with any of those words. It's just adjacent to those words. Decentralization, is just like this wonderful concept that draws a number of people in. But tonight, we're going to sort of like look at decentralization in 3 sort of major contexts. If we sort of look at our readings, hello and welcome, Eric. If we look at our readings. I think I've sort of thought it would be nice to bucket these in the context of technology, groups of people, and the state. And feel free to sort of like challenge those. But we've done a number of readings that sort of help sort of frame and set each of those contexts. And because we're here to think critically, I think it's one of the more interesting things we can do is sort of play those contexts off of each other, looking for insights. And one thing I did want to do sort of as a bit of an exercise, if you haven't already done this before we start, it's just to like, now that you've done some reading on the topic, if you haven't already, like, just write down your own like quick interpretation or definition of what the word decentralization means for you. We're not going to go around and share it. I don't think we should. I think it'd be more interesting to just write a note to yourself that we'll hopefully review at the end of this. So I'm going to leave like a minute, not too long. And I don't want you to think too hard about it because like you've already done the work. And so yeah, let's take 1 minute and just do a definition for decentralization. How's everybody feeling? Anyone need more time? No. Awesome. Kevin.
I was just gonna, should we do like a quick round of introductions too? Or is this...
Wait, that sounds just like a good idea. Do you want to start, Kevin? And then I can call him out.
Sure. I'm Kevin Nguyen. I'm a part of EDGI, the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. We're one of the partners of the Data Together kind of network. I've been a long-term volunteer there for the past 3 years, and for the past year, the part-time community coordinator. I've been, on the email list and sending out messages and stuff like that. Popcorn style, I pick Matt.
I'm Matt Price. I was involved in EDGI from very close to the beginning until not that long ago, and I teach at the University of Toronto, and I'm here to talk to people. Oh, I get to pick. Is that what we're doing? How about Kelsey, who was here early?
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm at EDGI and have been taking the lead on this Data Together initiative for the last year-ish. But I also think about decentralized web, and I have a meetup going on here in Seattle on decentralized web, and I don't know, I feel like I've introduced myself to all of you before. So let's move on to Eric.
Everybody, Eric Noss. I'm involved with EDGI and have been for the past 2 years, especially on the web monitoring side of things. And I teach at the University of Guelph. I'm gonna point at Dawn.
Hi, I'm Dawn. I feel like I have probably the same intro as Matt with slight variation. I feel like I'm like a emeritus member of EDGI and Data Together. I was around for a long time, but less so lately. I'm a PhD student. That's the difference. At University of Toronto, but I guess also think about decentralization stuff more broadly than my previous involvement in EDGI and Data Together. So it's always been an interesting space where worlds collide. And I guess I see, I'm gonna point to Mo.
Hello, I'm Mauve. I work at the DAP project, and I'm just interested, I guess, in decentralization in general. Lately, I've been a lot more into like community organizing and figuring out how to like better facilitate discussions and like have more open ways of people collaborating in tech in my community at that. And also just figuring out how to like get more artists to be using this decentralization tech rather than like, you know, business types. I don't know who hasn't spoken. Has Kevin gone?
I'll pick, there's two Stephans. Whichever Stefan wants to go first.
Is it my turn? Okay. So I'm Stefan. I do a lot of different things in the consulting space right now. And I used to work in government for a few years. I used to be in the academic world for a few years too. And now I'm kind of doing a lot of cooperativism with some other consulting colleagues to try and form a cooperative together. So learning a little bit about that, which is pretty exciting.
Fantastic. And Stefan, part two, do you feel like saying one?
It's how your name shows up in the Zoom, not what your actual name probably is.
And sorry, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, well, our computers are signed in on the same thing. Sorry. Stefan is my husband. I'm Heather. Took me a really long time to clue into what was happening, and I'm sorry. I came in late because I was in the wrong meeting room, so I apologize. Although Stefan did point out that I needed to write down a definition of decentralization, so I'm a little bit caught up. But can you repeat what I'm telling you so that I don't say the wrong thing right now?
Yeah, just what brings you here?
Oh, okay. Well, Stefan, my partner, had told me about this reading group, and when he described it to me, I got very, very excited because a very, very, very long time ago, I did an MA in Culture, Science, and Technology, and also I'm an artist, so I have a BFA, and then I did that, and got really interested in a lot of different stuff to do with critical theory of interactive media and philosophy of science and sociological feminist critique of things like reproductive technologies. And then proceeded to go a different way and haven't been thinking about those things for a very long time. And that was over 10 years ago. So now I'm really excited to start thinking about the issues that affect this time and this moment. And this seems like a really great place to do it. So I'm very excited to participate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather. This is great. Yeah, you see this a lot. We use this as a sign of support. Yeah.
I'll make sure not to do that when I'm like, whoa, stop.
Yeah, or you can. I mean, if you do it enough, you'll get the attention of somebody on here. Okay. But thank you, everybody, for joining. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm B5 or Brendan O'Brien. I'm calling from Brooklyn, and I work in a project called Query, and we do decentralized open data. built partially on IPFS, ideally with more decentralized things in the future. Yeah. And so with that, we've kind of all jotted down a quick definition. And I think from here, I really actually love the way that the readings were sort of truncated into sort of 3 major groups. And I definitely found that having Sarah Friend's introduction, her like just 10-minute like quick sort of jump in was a great framing for a lot of this conversation, given that she sort of like had 3 questions right out the gates that I thought sort of like helped tee off this kind of discussion. And so I thought I just put that to the group as a starting point to just hear what others' definition of decentralization is. And if you feel the need to sort of like pull in a different reading or pull the discussion in a different direction, feel free. So for anyone, like, what does decentralization mean to them? I know it's the same as like the question just asked you to write down, but maybe it's different in the context of Sarah's sort of invocation of the phrase.
I can pull
Kelsey
up.
and then Kelsey and then Mauve.
I can pull up Sarah's questions just in case you had to go search around your notes for them. But she asked, "What is decentralization? Do we want decentralization? And are there limits to decentralization?" And Brendan, I totally agree that I think these are questions. I feel like we end up asking the first one and not the other 2 a lot. So I'm really excited to go into, especially critiques of what decentralization is. But I don't have a direct answer to what is decentralization.
Yeah, so to me, decentralization, I guess it's almost like a practice or a look at how power structures end up looking. So one thing that's been on my mind a lot is, like, to me, a decentralized group is one where power is kind of bottom up and individuals ultimately have autonomy, and then they collaborate with others so that they can form consensus and like work together, rather than centralization where you have someone up top and it's a top-down hierarchy where they have some sort of needs and then they have the others kind of like fulfill those needs. So for me, decentralization is really like having power spread up and organizing bottom up rather than having power concentrated and organizing top down. That's been kind of like my big thing. Also like plurality, and there not being like a one thing, but like a bunch of things that are like loosely interacting.
Awesome. Dawn?
I mean, I have a sort of textbook definition I lean on, which is maybe not helpful, but I'll say it. So delegating decision-making and authority away from delegating decision-making and activities away from a central authority, which is kind of like, I think, the like abstract way it gets framed in a political context. I don't know if it is totally right. I don't know if you want to leave it abstract like that when you move it into like a technical space. And I would just, the only thing I would also say is I really thought it was a cool collision of readings that tried to represent both technical and political sort of sides of the coin. And I remember look way up last year when we did what is a decentralization, I think Matt said, was like flagging the kind of like lineage or the genealogy of the term. And that's something that I've been thinking about lately, is like, where has decentralization been used is also a question that I'm interested in. So I think these readings support asking that, which is cool.
One thing I want to highlight about the word decentralization, and this is why, Brendan, when you asked us to write down definitions, I put a note in the chat. I was like, this is harder than I thought it would be. And the reason is because it's defined in opposition. And I think that's really interesting because I don't think that we have a non-antagonistic word for what we're talking about. And it reminds me a lot of, basically what it suggests is that there's a tendency to centralize. And like, we're probably familiar with this in power structures, is that it's like really easy to have there be one source of truth and much harder to have there be several sources of input and also a decision. And it reminds me a lot of some of Rich Bartlett. I think we've read him before in this. Has written about decentralized power structures and patterns as it relates to the Inspiral Cooperative. Sorry, kitten's making messes. And basically he talks about like how they have to actively work to continuously decentralize, because power, like if you're in a decentralized organization and what that means is that you just don't name someone as a leader, then you end up with people secretly in charge rather than transparently in charge. And if you want actual decentralization, you need people to say, hey, I noticed that I've been accidentally becoming a central node. How do we deconstruct that?
Heather.
Okay, did you say Heather? Yeah. My definition is not different than what other people said, and I basically said distributed network whereby power is not top down, and I, like Kelsey, struggled after writing distributed network, and then I tried to think of how to say the next part without negating something else, and that was really hard, and I didn't want to, but it's like, it's in the word. Decentralized is already a negation, so one of the qualities to me that's interesting about decentralized networks or decentralized knowledge or decentralized power structures is that what we have is emergent, that where direction, intention, and all the things you just described, Kelsey, as well, that about decision making or who's in charge of something or taking responsibility is an emergent property of a group. And so I think it's ripe for coming up with other words. I think people have probably already worked on this, about coming up with a word that's not a negation. But one place that might be really useful to look is pedagogy. So I'm an early childhood educator, and also I've taught at university level, but right now I've been a preschool teacher for a long time. And my interest is in alternative pedagogies, such as Montessori, Reggio Emilia, and Waldorf as well, but I don't teach in that vein. And they're very much about emergent learning or inquiry-based learning. I think I'm 44, so any of you that are much younger might have already gotten to do this when you were in school, when you were little, but I didn't. And I wish that I had. I think now it's quite common so maybe there's a lot of language within alternative pedagogies that would be useful for thinking about decentralizing our sense of direction and agency and intention setting.
It's fantastic. Stefan, do you want to follow that?
Yeah, that's great. Really great discussion. I just want to, just before I say something, I just want to say one thing about my screen going black. It's only because I will be kind of going away to tend to a kid if the kid needs my assistance at some point. So that's why my screen's going black, but I have you on speaker so I can hear everybody in the discussion. So yeah, my thought when I was trying to define decentralization, well, I couldn't. I was sitting there not being able to. But then hearing everybody else talk about it, I thought maybe I would add another layer to thinking about how to define decentralization, which I kind of have been thinking about in relationship to the readings, which is this maybe almost like a XY axis where you have decentralization and representation. And it seems like with centralization, you have the need for more representation and more opportunities for mediation and media kind of slotting in there. And then with decentralization, there's kind of much more of a need for kind of facilitation as opposed to representation. And so I just want to kind of throw that weird little Venn diagram or whatever you want to call it into the mix. Because when I was reading those readings, I was thinking about how a lot of these examples that are upheld as examples of decentralization, really in a lot of ways, it's people kind of governing themselves somewhat. And what that involves and entails is a lot of conversation, a lot of facilitation, a lot of over communication. And when you see centralization, it's kind of the opposite. There isn't a two-way street between communicators and what's communicated out as like broadcast. And so maybe narrowcast is also an interesting dichotomy too, broadcast and narrowcast. With narrowcasting, we're still in a centralized paradigm, but it's decentralized. So the conversation isn't two-way. And anyways, some thoughts. So that's it for me.
Mo, did you have something? Oh, you're adjusting headphones. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's very interesting to hear that almost all of the initial reactions sort of seem to originate from the sort of political side of things. This question of like, I'm hearing a lot of like dancing around the phrase power and power distribution, which I think is really interesting. So I think to that end, I think to support some of what you were saying, Stefan, Sarah's asked us to sort of consider this question of like the intersection of intersectional thinking and decentralization in her very quick talk, and this question of like how those two things play against each other. And I think that some of what you were saying to me gets at some of that questioning of like, do we need, if we can think of decentralization as existing on a spectrum, and can we consider the spectrum? I'm sort of misphrasing her a little bit here, but like the sort of general vibe is, do we have to consider the whole of the spectrum to be able to sort of be able to pull this into our heads properly? But I think with that, I think it's worth to sort of like try and pull the conversation back towards the technical folks for a little while and put the technical pinning on it. I think it's really interesting. A lot of us sort of came at this from the like, okay, and I don't think that that's uncommon. I think a lot of us come to the word decentralization from a political sort of like trajectory, and maybe that's not fair, and so feel free to like yell at me for that. But I think when we think about decentralization from a technical sort of side of things, it was very interesting to see Vitalik Buterin's sort of just like decentralization is 3 key concepts. Just like it's pretty simple: is compute power distributed relatively evenly? Does the whole network compute faster? Is the whole network able to process more transactions than the sum of its parts effectively? And can we make sure that control of the network isn't concentrated more than 51% of the people on the network? That's a very cut and dry definition of decentralization. And I think we should sort of like, to me, I feel like there's a tension that often exists when we introduce the technology framing to the sort of politics framing, where the technologists really want us to interpret the phrase decentralization quite specifically. We have decentralization meaning a specific suite of characteristics of a network and the way that it behaves. But the thing that draws a lot of us to this, in my mind, is this political framing, this question of, well, we're here because we want to have an effect on a method of organizing. And to me, that's really interesting. I just want to throw that on the table. So I've got Kelsey, then Matt, then Eric. Did you have something to? Kelsey, Matt, Eric?
I think that's really, I like the specificity of that technical definition because it's also clearly about power. It's just that the power is really specifically defined in this network because it's code, it's made of rules. What's really fascinating to me that I cannot resolve in my head is when we talk about decentralization in terms of social structures, it is almost entirely about increasing individual trust. And when we talk about it in a technical context, it is almost entirely about removing the need for trust through technology. And I can't, that there's so much cognitive dissonance in using the same language and thinking about both things in the same conversation that none of the metaphors work. I would love if we can resolve some of that confusion in this conversation.
If I'm up next, that's confusing to me because that gave me a whole other thing to think about. But it seems to me that like one way to begin the conversation is, where does decentralization, from what qualities or associations does decentralization acquire a kind of moral authority for people like us? Like, why do we think, oh, decentralization good? And it seems to me there's one set of technical arguments about robustness of a network, but then there's a set of political arguments that we've just been describing. They're not all necessarily compatible with each other. So they're kind of libertarian and anarchist decentralizers who may have pretty different views about where the good resides, but they share this word, right? And I think that, like, doing some of the readings today, I felt like probably a lot of the times we're guilty, I feel like certainly I am probably a lot of the time guilty of a kind of slippage between the technical and moral political senses of the term. So like attributing to the technical features the moral characteristics of shared power, when there's no reason to believe, or at least this was my sense from deconstructing decentralization, which I think, like, I really liked. Brendan didn't like that much. I'm totally interested to hear the critique. That there's no need for those technical structures to actually move power out of to deconcentrate power. So you can have technically decentralized infrastructure that still concentrates power in a small number of hands. And that seemed like a bummer that we should pay attention to.
With a free ringtone. Eric.
I'm happy to cede my time to Mauve if you want to make a direct response to that.
Oh, thank you. I think like Bitcoin and blockchain and the fintech side of decentralization is an excellent example of decentralization that's super centralized, or even just like projects end up having centralization just kind of like hidden underneath. In the fintech case, it's actually like super obvious where the centralization is, and it's inside money. Because at the end of the day, since the whole system is geared around like how do I keep money, work with money, it goes back to, if you have money, you have power in the system, and like if you have money, you get more money. And it's kind of like a barrier to entry to everyone else. So it's like, even if it's distributed, the power dynamics aren't necessarily decentralized, I'd say. Like, I think, like, if I could say another thing regarding this stuff, like decentralized is one thing, but then there's also like, is it just a distributed system? Is it peer-to-peer? And then like, is there like a single implementation? So these are like other technical qualifiers that drastically change the way it works. But yeah, that's a super good worry. And thank you for mentioning it.
That's actually, I'm really glad you went before me, because that actually sets up the comment I was going to make really well, which is that I don't actually really I'm not a technical person, and I don't really per se, and that's not where I come at this, at least at first glance. It's more on the political end of things. And so when I was asked, what is decentralization? That was a really tough question. And the first kind of word or thing that came to my mind was distributed. I think this is also, I think, Heather, that term was in your definition as well. And then I think about it a little bit more from the technical side of things, and just, like looking at Sarah Friend's presentation. I didn't get a chance to hear it, but there is a technical difference, right, between the classic kind of centralized, decentralized, distributed. So, that's just an interesting observation that I made, that, there's, actually some technical differences there that I don't fully understand, but that are probably really important and have political implications. And maybe part of it has to do with scale. So as a geographer, I come to a lot of questions through the lens of scale, but especially questions around decentralization. And so it's a little bit of it may not seem particularly practical and at first, but like the question for me would be, you know, at what scale is a network decentralized, right? And it can depend on sort of how far you're looking into the network or what extent of the network you're looking at. And so, Mo, when you mentioned things like, you know, part of the network can be kind of centralized underneath or hidden underneath or whatever, that raises for me a lot of questions of like, to really call something decentralized or in the process of being decentralized, then it depends on what scale we're looking at. This came up for me in Eleanor Ostrom's article that we read. It was like, great, cities are doing all this work to combat climate change. And it's a sort of decentralized approach to climate change. But you know, cities are just one level of analysis. And yes, it's more decentralized than nation states or international agreements. Cities also have their own structures that are very uneven and unequal, that we may not call distributed or decentralized. So
I love it. Did I miss any hands? Does anybody feel like they have a burning thought right now they want to jump in on? Heather, go ahead.
Getting better at unmuting. Okay. I have two different things to throw into the mix that are not fully formed thoughts. They're more like just things I thought about while other people were talking. One of them is actually me poaching an idea that I've heard Stefan, the real Stefan, bring up many times about, so I hope I'm not butchering this, Stefan, feel free to jump in, that we have a problem, and this is in response to what Kelsey was saying about the trust issue, about this weird inversion of trust and our expectations of trust in the world of tech and data versus the world of decentralized power in terms of political decision-making and power. And that is that historically, or at least in our current moment, politics is meant to be, we think of politics as being a space that's value-laden, whereas science is meant to be value-free. Hasn't always been that way, but that's how it is now. And Stefan had said that he wrote a piece where he advocated for possibly flipping that on its head and searching for value-free politics and value-laden science. Now, that's not original. You know, there's plenty of work out there done by Bruno Latour and others about value-laden science. But the idea of thinking of politics as something that could somehow be value-free. Now, I can't speak to that, but I thought it kind of played with this idea of trust, because when we try to remove trust, in the case of decentralizing knowledge networks, it's kind of a way of us looking for a value-free tech, for better or for worse. And then in the other definition of decentralization, which was about politics, as Kelsey pointed out, what we're looking for is building trust, which is value-laden politics. So a little bit that has to do with how we already see those things. And what happened if we stopped trying to do away with the responsibility of trust in our tech and data decentralization, and then stopped worrying about it quite so much in our decision-making networks? I don't know if it would be good or bad, but it's something to think about, how some of these things flip and turn places, and how does that change if we change those definitions away from or if we have that Gestalt shift or something, does it suddenly make everything else legible? There is a dog constantly licking my arm right now. That's why I'm going like this. Stop it. So it's because I'm baking and she smells sugar. So the other thing was in relation to what Mo said, which was about the money problem. And again, I'm just going to throw this into the mix of what you said. I thought that was all really interesting. One way I think about the money problem is in relation to hoarding. So our problem with money right now is that there's people hoarding money. And our problem with centralized power networks, or centralized power on the one hand and centralized networks of data and knowledge, is again, it's like there's a hoarding of capital, there's a hoarding of knowledge, is what I'm trying to get at. In my work, which Steph and I used to organize something called the Wayward School, that was skill and knowledge sharing workshops. We're both really interested in permaculture and do a lot of community building work. And we continually butt into this problem of, even when people are kind of interested in the idea of doing these things and becoming decentralized, becoming really DIY, they still like to hoard their knowledge. They like to be the one that knows how to brew something from scratch, or they don't want other people to know where you can gather nettle. And I know that's a really tangible, concrete example, and I'm not doing a great job of applying it to data and tech. But I think that's a little bit, I think that's part of the thing we're all kind of circling around, is like what people go into it wanting, and then what it's capable of doing, and then what's gumming it all up, you know? And there she is. And that's all.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to pick on either Don or Matt, who have been lighting up the chat, to come forth and share some views. Matt's pointing at Don. Don's staring at Matt.
I'll just say, this is like a slight aside, so I'll say it super briefly. I resonate super hard with what you just said, Heather, about like that, like hoarding of knowledge or something in some of those like DIY spaces, having been active in them myself. And I will say this lately because I feel like I'm on a reading groove because there's been because of the recent election and politics. My mind is like, I think sometimes maybe there's just been a failure in those spaces to like actually have an accurate analysis of power. And maybe that's why they don't see what that does as like a form of holding on to power. Because I think it's not always a sincere act when people don't know how to like let go of their knowledge. But that's like totally an aside. What I was saying in the chat, I was trying to like think of this thought experiment. It's a really cool inversion, I think, to say this, like, okay, if we talk about, if we want to, I don't know, figure out how to speak about science as value laden, what does it mean to think about politics as value free? And I was just saying, I'm not sure if I would want such a thing, but also it felt a little bit like Fukuyama's argument about the end of history, which is like sort of this like, we tend towards democracy, like written in the 90s, like liberal Western democracies are kind of this ascendant form. Like we did it, we cracked that nut, we've solved politics. And then it was like, oh, actually we haven't. And so I wonder actually if trying to think about how something gets rendered value free helps you understand the assumptions and the things that are already like are currently treated as value free that aren't around you. Like maybe that's a powerful like lens or like way to like look at stuff. So that was kind of cool just to like, yeah, just to muse on.
Stefan?
I feel like I should just clarify a little bit. But yeah, the lens that Heather mentioned there, in no way would I be suggesting that it's possible to have a value-free politics, but it was rather just the flipping of the lens almost to be able to see just like, you know, just a mental somersault in a way to help you kind of see the thing a little differently. And part of it was actually what I'm trying to remember now. This is like about 7 or 8 years ago now that I wrote all that stuff up. But I think I was turning to Manuel Delanda's work quite a bit at the time. And he kind of wrote a lot of stuff in his book, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, kind of all about how social and political forms are just kind of these materialistic kind of creations, and you could kind of study them in that kind of very kind of neutral way. And I thought that was an interesting book for sure, very interesting book. But yeah, just jumping on what Heather was saying about the what would it be called? I guess the knowledge network, or kind of some of the aspects that were in the Seen Like a State reading. I think that problem of hoarding is very, very funny to get around, and I think it's gendered for sure. There's something going on there, and in the tech space especially, I see that as happening. I see that in any space where there's a lot of expertise and kind of insight around having to really think through kind of, I guess, what you would call algorithmic thought. And so this is another bridge to another kind of conversation we're all having, which is this difference between the tech and the political, and how to kind of think through them differently. And I would say that the distinction between algorithmic and heuristic thinking is really helpful on this front, because if you're looking at it algorithmically, you could see the code beneath the decentralized networks themselves as a form of centralization, in the sense that they had to be drafted and composed and written and agreed upon by a group of experts, similar to the way that laws within a legal code are also developed in that way, right? And so in a way, law and legal code, although they exist within a centralized entity, are themselves, you know, a kind of decentered process. Once they exist, they kind of produce effects without kind of too much human input. But the power gets baked into it, and the power gets baked into the decentralized technical network as well in this algorithmic way. And then the heuristic element of decentralization is more around kind of the squishy feelings that humans feel, and the ideas and the values that they have, and how they kind of come together and reach agreement or work through disagreement around all of that. And in that way, heuristics and rules of thumb and principles and values and all of these kind of phrases that we have to try to capture, you know, where I'm coming from on this issue or whatever it might be, then come into play, and then need to kind of be conversed through in this non-representational way, or at least like as unmediated as possible kind of way, synchronous communication, whatever you want to call it. So it's funny, this whole conversation, I keep going back to all these dualisms and dichotomies, and I don't know what's going on. It's very strange. Anyways, that's it for me.
This is great. I think that's a wonderful thing. Stefan, that's great. And I want to try and pull to some of that algorithmic and the sort of heuristic and framing, because I think that sort of echoes what Kelsey was saying a little bit about this like cognitive dissonance of the word trust. And I want to kind of like, again, just like kind of provide some anchoring on the technical side, just totally step into the technical side of this. I think that there's a bit of a misnomer around the phrase trustless environments. And so I'm going to sort of like start from the technical framing or the algorithmic framing. I think that if you really sort of like try to bake it down and take as subjective a view as possible, that a lot of there is sort of a cogito in modern decentralization movement. By cogito I mean like the Cartesian sense of like I think, therefore I am. And I think the cogito of trustless environments is cryptography. And I think that we sort of have this, and we believe and understand that even in technical circles, when you talk about cryptography, it is like oriented in math, and it feels like a universal law, right? Like it feels like when you encrypt something, its foundations are in mathematical proofs, and those mathematical proofs form a kind of rock upon which you can layer other techniques out of a sort of hell of trustlessness towards something that resembles trust. And I think that's the sort of framing that is positioned when we talk about decentralized technologies. Personally, I intentionally want to invoke this sort of like Cartesian framing, because I think that it has a lot to say about a sort of gendered method of believing that you are capable of beginning at zero and moving to a completely cohesive system in a sort of single line of thought. And I have to sort of like draw my hands like this, because what I think is scary about this framing is that along the way, you cannot do that without at some point layering on a technology that intertwines that heuristic framing, this like set of values, right? Like we have cryptography. If you look at any single thing, if you layer it up and you turn it into Bitcoin, you've layered on a sort of capital market sort of heuristic onto your technology, right? Or if you turn it into IPFS or DAT, you've now layered on a sort of communication protocol, HTTP type replica, sort of free information sharing sort of slant to your the way that you're thinking. And so I think there's like a question about what do we do with these things and at what point do they stop? I think it's really interesting that both DAT and IPFS stop much sooner than a blockchain. And I think that there's an interesting thing there. But what I think is, what I want to sort of point to is, I think as someone who has sort of like struggled with this a little bit on the tech side, is like, I think there is a place where the heuristic enters, and it's very, very, very difficult to know when that is, because you feel so confident because of the math. I've got lost while I'm speaking, so who wants to go next? I think Matt had his hand up.
So this really makes me want to think about Walsh and have the conversation about her piece, the deconstructing decentralization one, because it seems to me that what is at issue in that piece is where the kind of ground is to be found, like the foundation of the argument, and there's like a repetition, maybe at a different scale, of the exact same kind of Cartesian error that you described. Like I found certainty. Now we can start solving problems because certainty is here, right? And of course, what happens with Descartes, then you get Kant and Fichte and Hegel, and it gets more complicated and more difficult. And in the same way, so like it becomes the certainty of the cryptographic solution becomes an ideological conviction, which wins arguments that maybe it shouldn't win, right? Like, so it's able to win arguments that it doesn't deserve to win, maybe. And her her argument is that you can find concentrations of power and watch them being applied to these systems that the initial description would lead you to believe are immune to the application of power. And what's useful about that is that it shows that the systems are not purely technical, but are also social. And when we pretend that they're purely technical, we misrepresent them to ourselves. And we also maybe participate a little bit in a con job, right? I mean, like Bitcoin could be also interpreted as a huge con that's being run on the world economy. So anyway, what I'd like to hear is where you felt like she went wrong in that argument, because to me it was, I think, because I was like so friendly to it. I saw I was like, yeah, okay, yeah, sister.
I guess I'll respond to that, and then Mo, do you want to go? Yeah, my response is I just felt like her argument was too weak. I think she attacked the wrong things. I think if you're like, hey, a bunch of folks stepped into action and changed and patched Bitcoin to prevent a sort of like centralization, or like they behaved in a centralized way to and that's like, and that should be cited as evidence that this is an impurity in the system. Like, I agree that we should absolutely be using the social framing. I just think it could be applied better. And that's what drove me so nuts about it. I'm like, if that's the thing that we're going to talk about, like, yeah, it is proof that you could have one day like a situation where someone could use that same set of 11 people in the sort of Bitcoin security disclosure could behave in a sort of like odd, in a way that sort of is a power grab. That's totally true, but I think that like the design of the network itself is like, it invites much more interesting questions about centralization, decentralization, and its central sort of like tenets or claims. I think that there's a double click that happens when we call it a decentralized thing that we all experienced firsthand. We're sucked in for political reasons, and then and the cryptography keeps us connected because it sort of seems to make good on some of those promises. But that double click has already happened in my mind. I feel like that's why I like this sort of like my version of it better. Not to like do my own horn, but I like that the idea that like, wait, you think that you've built something incredibly like decentralized is based in cryptography, and it's like, yeah, but like as soon as we hit some layer, like this stops being the kind of decentralization that we showed up for. The meaning of the phrase flips when we get to the technology. The thing that brought us there is not the thing that is keeping us here. And I think that that's more interesting to me personally. And so it's just frustrating to sort of see people who have write access to the repo. Like, to Mo's point, you can write another implementation. And I think that it's sad that we don't look at the fact that there are like 25 gajillion currencies out there, and like that is in itself a kind of decentralization and should be seen as points in the column of like, well, Bitcoin isn't the only game in town, right? And that's that's a form of decentralization, and it's not a fun one to look at, but it's yeah, I think there are better ways to sort of like do a takedown personally. And sorry, Mauve, I have totally interrupted you. Sorry, you're muted.
Oh, yeah, one thing I wanted to like touch on is I actually wish we had less of the logic around like trust and like less of the cryptographic proofs that we don't need to trust people in the tech. I actually think we should probably put trust and all of that on the people. So like if I want to trust someone to have my data, I should like trust them in need space. And like having fully automated trustless systems, for one thing, like capturing every meaning of trust in a smart contract is so like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Like I think especially looking at like real contracts and like real promises you make to people, like they're a lot more loose and there's just so much more ambiguity, whereas like a machine, it's just so much harder to express that ambiguity and just like the fluid nature of trust and of agreements. So like personally, like I love crypto for like making sure that data can't be intercepted or changed as it's being transported between people. But I'm not a fan of crypto like automating decisions and like stuff that humans could actually be doing in a way that makes more sense for their specific context rather than this imagined idea of what trust is for all of humanity or for the whole network.
Yeah. I'm curious what you guys think. I put this in the chat a bit ago, but what do you think about the idea that, so we talked before about the problem of scale in trust in social societies, right? Where basically if it's like 20 people, you can look around the room and be like, okay, we're all gonna be nice to each other. We're not gonna all, like there isn't gonna be one of us who comes in and just screws everything up. And if there is, they'll leave, because that's, how social cohesion works. In a way that it doesn't work on, say, a country scale, a city scale, an internet scale. So what about the idea that we use cryptography in networks to create not trustlessness, which, as I've discussed at some depth with Rob when trying to understand how decentralized web actually works, like in the decentralized web, you have a lot of elements that you don't have to have trust about, that you don't have to think about, right? Because there's all this hashed data. But ultimately, if you're trying to come back to a single root hash, in order to ask for that root hash, or public key in the DAC case, you have to trust somebody. And there is no version of a decentralized web framework where you don't have to trust anyone at all. I feel like maybe what that's trying to do, and I don't know if anyone said this explicitly, is not to get rid of trust, but to reduce the number of entities you actually have to trust to a size that is manageable on a social level. I don't know. I'm curious if anybody has a critique of that thought.
Eric's got half a thought. Let's hear Eric.
Half a thought, which is just to say that there's sort of scale in the sense of number of people, and maybe also geography, but then also temporal scale, which I think has come up in at least some of the readings, only some of which I've done anyway, but like the Ostrom article, right, talks about the need for more rapid decision-making around climate change, right? And so I just wonder if there's something here also about sort of time scale.
Could I comment on it? Or who's in the queue? Okay, cool. I like the idea of reducing the number of people you need to trust for stuff to work. I actually really like that. It makes trust a little bit more manageable. The problem I have with this state of things is that the smaller amount of people you trust are either tech bros, who I find it very hard to trust, or investors of tech companies, or just like regular business people or people with money. which are like all people that I don't want to trust as like my building block. I'd rather like trust, you know, like a person I'm interacting with. So like I like when we can use tech for that and kind of like ignore some of the tech folks somehow, or like maybe find some tech folks that are more like hippy dippy. But like, yeah, I think like trusting fewer people is nice when those are people like you can trust, rather than those are people that you have to trust and can't really opt out of.
Okay, I'll finally go. I think I'm gonna try, this might not work. So I guess kind of, actually I think I can connect to what Mo just said, but also reeling it back a little bit, Brendan, to what you said. I mean, about the kind of like, the sort of cryptographic proof is this like, this kernel or this like sort of small building block. I mean, I agree with Matt's response about kind of the fact that these are always already socio-technical systems. The thing is that we've not figured out good ways of like thinking those two things together, or like a language that like reflects that. So we, I think, veer into one side or the other. And like, I guess that's what I'm interested in, is like how to be aware of that and like how to like recognize that, and doing that careful recognition around some of these like decentralizing projects. But then to think about this idea of like trust, or why, like the version of trust as rendered technical, or trustlessness rendered technical, and its reliance on cryptography, as opposed to like actual models of trust at scale. Like, I think that there's a concern I have with only using the concept of trust, because it's sort of like this like form of methodological individualism, right? Like it's sort of like locating in an individual, or at the scale of one person and their motivation, like a way to think about phenomena that might be better, like in collectives that might be expressed differently. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, so I was like thinking, okay, like what is trust? Like that I have one-on-one, or like the trust that I would have with a group of 20 people, be they tech bros or not. And if whether I don't want that to be like the kind of trust I have. And maybe there is a way that some imperfect representation of that exists in like public key cryptography, like say Keybase or something. And like how we have to have, like there's like all these chains of proofs and ways that we say we know each other to each other, and like publish that places. But that isn't the same way that trust, and trust doesn't feel like the right word. Like I'm comfortable being in a group of friends, you know, or like if I'm in like a circle where I know 5 people really close, but there's like 20 people there, but I would feel more comfortable saying something in that group than I would in another group. And so, yeah, I was just trying to think about like where trust breaks down, or if there's this like implicit like individualism that like is being surfaced there, and maybe there's other ways to think about it, and like how would those be implemented technically. And I was actually thinking about on Scuttlebutt, like kind of that way of like peer broadcast, or like something about the way that you end up actually transmitting, or like, you know, just thinking about how that log functions is maybe a way that also doesn't rely on sort of this like individual relationship. Anyway, these are ramblings. It's been a long day.
Scuttlebutt's a really good call. I'm going to try this on for size, to see if this is any way amenable. I think it's interesting that like the centricity of the trust word, and I'm wondering if we just take a framing for a second, that maybe it is a very common trick for tech when we're developing technologies to sort of co-opt or adopt language that, and sort of like, it almost feels like as the second movers, we sort of pull these meanings towards technical centers. And I feel like this conversation has centered around the phrase trust because of the way that the word trust is used to describe the environments that we're on the technical side. But it also feels like we have a similar double-click phenomenon happening, where, Mo, if you were talking about trust as a relationship between people, not as a provable thing, right? But we have this word trust that has been moved into this provable thing territory. And I just want to know how others feel about the idea that, like, in technology, we tend to sort of just lift these terms to describe technical concepts. And then it seems to like maybe be part of this sort of like, what if we just called it SNARFAR and said it's the SNARFAR protocol, and then all it does is do sort of some method of making sure that all of your data moves correctly. And Kelsey.
Whenever we make qualitative things quantitative, we're usually wrong and trust things too much. And I'm trying to think of a good example, because I know I've come across several recently, but I guess a canonical one would be the IQ test, where to some extent it does measure intelligence, and to another extent it measures how well you match a training set, and to a third extent that training set is based on your existing class and race. But because it's a number and it was a way of turning things that were not originally quantifiable into something that looks a lot like math, we think it's right. Or a similar, I guess, I worry a lot about like when we start to move into quantifiable genetics spaces, where there are some data sets to draw on that are much larger than other data sets that we draw on. For example, like my Native Alaskan ancestry means that a lot of the genetic testing that you can do is less valid in my case than in other cases, but there are no confidence intervals shown at the point of interpretation. So I really worry about anything that turns something not mathy into something that looks mathy enough that people who don't understand how it came to be will just look at it and say, well, that's probably right. It came out of a computer.
To bring that towards the reading, I think seeing like a state, that was like the whole point of the book to me, because it was all like people coming in and being like, all right, we need to quantify stuff. And part of the quantification, they introduced biases and erased a whole bunch of stuff that was actually super relevant to the contexts. So like at the top, you have like a number, and that number is useful for like a bureaucrat, but is just completely destroying the actual context it's being applied on, which absolutely sucks. So I agree.
Heather, you've got some great stuff going in chat. Do you want to jump in with any of that? Or I apologize about picking on you and you feel picked on.
No, it's okay. I've decided that maybe instead of taking notes, I should put my notes there so they can be discursive. I realized just now as you were talking that I accidentally stated something as a I wrote something as a statement, which I meant as a question, which was that we can and should ask about the motivations of the algorithm. I was asking that more like, shouldn't we? Should we? Who are we questioning? And then that was bringing me to these other places about corporeality is what we're talking about, right? That's the promise of these technologies, is that they're immortal, in some ways infallible, that they continue on into posterity. I don't know if that's grammatically correct. So that's where my head is going with this discussion, but it keeps going back to straight up philosophical questions, and you want to maybe pull it away from there back into these more specific questions about the technology itself. I have a hard time with that. I don't have a hard time with wanting to do that. I personally always have a hard time doing that, because one of the motivating questions that I have whenever I think about technology, media, electronic communications, and data networks has to do with agency and whether or not text itself could be said to have agency, and thinking of language as actually our first technology, because it's something that's outside of our body, that extends our capabilities and can exist without us. Like it expands our personal, what we can do with our bodies. It's a tool, etc. Now, I don't think that sounds that crazy to all of you, but when I would posit that to my advisors when I was in dissertation mode, that was a real like, I don't know if I agree with that kind of thing. And so therefore I always come back to it as whether or not we can think of language as the first technology. and then also whether or not text can be said to have agency. And to me, those two questions are really alive in any discussion about blockchain, about decentralization, and all of the things we're bringing up here about trust and representation, which again, avatar representation, that means something stands in for something else. Again, that kind of extension of ourself into a non-corporeal realm. And then back to the Descartes that you brought up, that I slaughtered when I tried to make a point about it being I think, therefore I doubt, which is like, no, that's not what I meant to say. I doubt, therefore I think is one way I've heard it put. And I doubt, therefore, or I doubt, therefore I am, sorry. And then I saw, okay, no, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. I'm bringing that up in relation to what you had pointed out about mathematical proofs and certainty. And then if we think of Cartesian as also being certainty, but it's actually rooted in doubt. And it also requires continual doubt. We find a truth, but we don't stay there. Or as Spock would say, wisdom is the beginning of logic, not the end. Or sorry, logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. You see, I'm a little dyslexic in ideas, so that's why I keep saying them backwards. Logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. So we have to continually doubt and displace, and or else we stagnate. We become anaerobic, basically.
It's lovely. Anyone we haven't heard from in a while want to step forward? Go for it.
You've heard from me, but I'll just kind of plus one, maybe both of the threads that you brought up, Heather. Like I think there's a lot, and you've referenced Latour at the beginning, but I think him as well as other science and technology scholars have talked a lot or thought a lot about kind of agency beyond non-humans, or agency of non-humans, so beyond humans, and like trying to study and understand that in context. And I think that's super fruitful. I was reading this book, or part of this book lately, by Carl Mitchum, Thinking Through Technology, Engineering and Philosophy, something. It's a very long title, but it's kind of about some of these like that sort of like these early conceptualizations around technology. I mean, I think he kind of ignores some of its roots, but yeah, I would also just say, I think it can be helpful to connect the sort of narrow way that sometimes we mean digital technology when we say technology, but to like reattach it to those much broader understandings of technology, because I think that opens up a way of thinking about like relationships to it, which is kind of what I'm interested in. So yes, I agree.
Oh my, Matt, do you want to just read that paragraph out loud of chat?
I don't know. I feel like the conversation, I had to be listening only halfway after trying to think through things that Don was saying. Just something that I've been wanting to say for a while is that when in these conversations about decentralization, I thought the unit of the entity that participates in a decentralized system is important. If you have a collective of collectives with a rigid hub at the center where representatives of those collectives make decisions, is it nonetheless the case that there are that we could describe that in some ways as a decentralized organizational structure? So anyway, I was thinking about that, and when Dawn started talking about the individualism that seems baked into the ideological structures that we've been discussing, I wrote some other stuff down. So.
Super good. Sorry to pick on you. I think now's a great time to try and sort of bring back one article that hasn't come up a ton, but I think might be fun to try and sew in as a theme here. See if we can't connect some dots. Maybe they don't. But the most dangerous notion in reinventing organizations to me, I think one of the central sort of thoughts brought forth there was like, I think might be a fun sort of like thought to start to draw to a close with, which is this idea that like, we started the conversation like with this notion that decentralization is sort of this defining and definition in opposition. And I think if we were sort of riff on the dangerous notion in reinventing organizations sort of article, it sort of gets asked us to sort of like say, hey, this stuff has been around for a while, and maybe this isn't an antonym. Maybe there are methods of organizing that have existed for a long time that when we came in and sort of like data colonized them, sort of swept over some very subtle ways of moving and conducting ourselves, as was sort of cited in that piece on sort of the way that different indigenous Californian tribes are sort of like are operating. And so like wanted to sort of like ask, like, I know we have the word decentralization being defined in opposition, but like in what ways has this conversation sort of are there other things that have existed outside of the technical framing, outside of the sort of like political framing, or maybe inside of the political framing, depending on how you want to think about it, that we sort of like trounced over because of the sort of like direction the discussion has gone. And if we just thought about it as like, maybe there is a sort of like original state or a different state or a version of the world in which decentralization isn't the counter hegemonic force, it's a force. It's a lot. It's pretty muddled. Anybody? Heather?
Short point, you could argue that it always was, because, in relation to chaos and order is constantly trying to deal with all of the stuff that it sees as too noisy and not producing the right information, right? So they're they rely on each other, but depending on your perspective, you could absolutely see that it already always was and is predominant, and that everything else is just like a desperate attempt to try to get on top of that. So I don't have an example for your actual question, what are some ways that we see that becoming predominant? I would argue maybe it is. It's just our fear of it, because we see it as messier, and that we don't just let it be.
Oh, I love that. Stephen, sorry to miss your hand.
No, it's okay. This has all been fascinating to listen to. I think that reinventing organizations piece was very interesting to me, in part because, a lot of the work that we're doing in our co-op right now is modeled off of some of the agreements and some of the organizational DNA that's inside of the Inspiral Handbook. And I know that they're very influenced by reinventing organizations amongst other ideas and whatnot. And I thought that what that article was getting at was also basically tying in with some of the other readings and some of the other authors' books as readings that aren't in the reading list. So Eleanor Ostrom's work around common pool resource governance. I think it's called Governing the Commons. Fascinating series of case studies in there that are all non-Western and all outside of the canon about how, people on the land base kind of contextually responded to, all of these different questions that we're dealing with here around power, around decision-making, around all of that. And then, a lot of the ideas that she was pointing out in that piece were looking at, examples from First Nations communities within the United States and how they've managed themselves on the land base. And there's like a thread here. I think you might be catching it now. There's a land base, right? And so when we are looking at things like what James C. Scott was talking about and seeing like a state where he's talking about Métis knowledge and kind of these ideas around, you know, work to rule, this idea that, you know, workers within industrialized factories would buck the trend and strike while working by working to the rule book. So working according to the algorithm as set out by management, then everything would be totally inefficient and ineffective and slow down. And so it was a way for them to resist was to completely follow the rule book. Because what they were experiencing contextually in these spaces was a kind of heuristic algorithmic blend between the human and the machine to try to understand how to make this thing operate the best way. And I think the same could be said about the blockchain space, which then, you know, to further on Brendan's critique of that one article, you know, you could then say that, oh yeah, that article does miss the point because it's kind of, you know, it's basically holding that entire ecosystem to this really difficult high standard that it's impossible to be held up to, because there will be a need to kind of jump in and tweak the technicalities of the things to help it work better, right? Because that's just how we relate with technology. That's how it's always been. So just coming back to the land-based piece, I think that in terms of land-based and in terms of the algorithmic and technical side of that, I think things like Internet of Things, all of these different technical networks that come into play with the land base in different ways and you know, measure it or monitor it or whatever. I think these are very interesting sites to begin thinking about, you know, how we can kind of take some of these older practices that have more to do with stewardship and sustainability and kind of caring for the earth and caring for people and their relationship to the earth, kind of these permaculture principles, taking that and like plugging it into some of this new technology to see if there's a way that we can leverage that to better deepen Métis knowledge, to better democratize Métis knowledge, because this is another thing that James C. Scott talked about, was how Métis knowledge just was kind of undemocratic in a lot of ways. And coming back to what we were talking about earlier around people, you know, kind of hoarding their knowledge. So maybe this is a way forward. I don't know.
Matt.
I mean, I think thinking about things like this, that it's worth reflecting on the fact that the idea of an algorithmic solution is related to the idea of like a rigid legal structure which guarantees equality before the law, and was the kind of ideology that promotes those systems, those kind of modernist systems that James Scott is deeply opposed to and has, you know, very important critiques of, was developed to address important kinds of injustices. And so like one question, interesting question, is like, what is it about some systems that seem to promote or to dampen injustice without the kind of rigid formality and weaknesses of like this algorithmic thinking? And one thing about systems that are based in the land somehow is that there's a shared commitment which is very dependable to preserving the land, because you can't get away with abusing that commitment, partly because of social pressures, but also because the land is is not forgiving of your destruction of it. So like, the question is, where is that commitment in these other endeavors, or these other technologies? Like, how do you guarantee that commitment, or how do you promote or create that commitment? At least that was the question that Stefan's thoughts raised for me. Like, is there some analogy that you can build into the system or promote at least in the system?
Don.
Also, just on that note, to think about what some of those models of stewardship were, say that like are in that kind of, say that maybe Ostrom profiles or the sort of like history of commons forms of stewardship, or like more traditional knowledge and traditional land practices practiced by communities worldwide. Like, I also think like what were the other forms that they were in relation to? Like, we read an article last semester from Peter Linebaugh about commons, and it was like, I mean, he just does this like really intense way of like being like talking about, yeah, actually a large percentage of UK, because this is the context he's focusing on, was held in commons, but a lot of it wasn't. And so it's like, I think a lot about like what were those practices operating alongside? And then I wonder, it's like, yeah, like how do you attach that kind of same level of commitment in maybe like these digital practices we're talking about, and like how do we understand them in their relationship to like the broader digital practices anyway?
Awesome. Yeah. And Kelsey's got a point. This does, I think, bring us to a close on our time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. This was a delightful discussion. Kelsey has a thing. Before we close, I do invite you to take a quick second and think about that definition you wrote down an hour and a half ago and see if it shifted at all. Maybe do that after the call. But Kelsey, you have some things that you would like to get across so that other people can leave on time or close to on time.
Yeah, just administrative stuff, which is to say, firstly, this call was recorded and I've been writing blog post versions of it. If you would like to read the blog post before it goes live and potentially edit it, you are welcome to do so. I will put it on GitHub. Please, I'll send it out to the mailing list, but also if you want to give me your GitHub username, I'll tag you when I make the pull request, and we give it 2 weeks. The second part of that is, if you don't want to be in it, usually what I do is put people's first names. If you would not like your first name associated with it, let me know, and ideally provide a cool alias. Another thing on the same vein is that we do have one that is currently set to go out Thursday if nobody puts more comments on it. If you want to read up on the data stewardship one, and it's in our GitHub repo, which, well, I'll just send that. I don't know. You guys can probably find it. It's github.com/datatogether/website. I think that's all. Kevin, can you think of anything else I should say right here?
No, just yeah. Brendan, Kelsey, and I will be staying on the line just to do some administrative stuff too.
Yeah, I will take this last opportunity to plug our third semester, which we have not picked the timing for yet, but join the Google group. We have centered on that as our way to disseminate information. There is a conversation happening. We're getting applause for concluding our thing. The readings are picked and organized. We have by the group. We open up a GitHub issue for each sort of one of these readings. So if you have any interest in joining, suggesting, and in particular, if you have any interest in facilitating, you do not need to be an expert facilitator, but we are definitely seeking facilitators. The topics for the next 6 sessions of semester 3 are selected. And so if one of them jumps out at you, most of the folks on there would be happy to either have a co-facilitator, or some of them even don't have a facilitator to begin with. Hopefully that helps. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And I think this brings us to a close. Heather, Stefan, and Mo in particular, it's so nice to see you guys. It's new faces. This is great.
Thanks, everybody. Take care, y'all. and we'll stay online. I'll stop recording.
Like the power.
Guys, nice to see y'all.
Yeah, good seeing
So
you.
nice to see you guys. Oh, it's super cool.
Yeah, go get some snowboarding in.
Yeah.
Gonna
Enjoy
be
it.
a month.
I'm gonna have to go to Alberta first.
They don't open the hills right now here. They're not open for like a while. They got
We are
so
still-
much snow in
still
Canada,
recording?
like holy fajoli. They had like whiteout conditions.